back after 2 weeks of silence. So not to strain it too much, I'll go ahead and use the microphone. I guess I was asked tonight to introduce Mathis because for about 20 years now, I've been stamping out uninformed happiness amongst undergrads by telling them that we were exceeding the Earth's capacity to support us and in fact further depleting that capacity to support us by living on Earth's capital rather than on its interests, and that Americans were using much more than our fair share, and so on and so forth. And I talked about so many different types of concepts that I confused many of them, and I certainly depressed all of them. So I was always looking for some concepts that would pull, or an approach that would pull together a lot of these different kinds of ideas into maybe just a smaller number of simpler, easier to understand human concepts, something that would help them to better understand what we mean by sustainability, but also to think about things like social equity and justice at the same time. And then in 1996, I found this little book, Ecological Footprint, and I felt it did a great job of pulling together a lot of those concepts. It introduced the idea of the ecological footprint, or the area required to support your demands on the earth, given your lifestyle, and also the idea of the fair earth share, which was to take all the earth's productive area, divide it by the population of the earth, and the result is your fair earth share, which I figure out to be about 1 hectare. If you set about half of the Earth's productive capacity aside to support other species and ecosystem services, and take half of the Earth's productive capacity for humans, that makes about 1 hectare per person. So after you calculate your ecological footprint, if it is 5 hectares, then it would take 5 Earths to support everybody at your lifestyle, or the average, I'm not sure what the average American footprint is. The latest calculation is about 9 hectares, 9.5 hectares. So it would take almost 10 Earths, and we've got those 10 Earths here tonight, almost 10 Earths to support everybody on Earth today at the average American lifestyle. So these are things that is a little easier for students to get their minds around these ideas and to think about things like the what constituted a fair earth share and ecological footprint. And blending those two ideas, sustainability and social equity, inspired a lot of us last spring to put on an event called the Global Justice Action Summit, which did just that, getting people to think about sustainability and social equity. We had a nice T-shirt, Global Justice Action T-shirt, so I brought one tonight for Mathis to thank him for helping inspire that idea. And now I better get on with the actual introduction. Mathis Wackernagel is currently the Director of Sustainability Programs for Redefining Progress, which is a nonprofit public policy organization that works to ensure a more sustainable and socially equitable world. He's worked with groups in France, Canada, Costa Rica, Mexico, Switzerland, and the U.S. He's published numerous articles and books trying to explain the concept of limits and sustainability and develop indicators for sustainability. His earlier training was in mechanical engineering, but his PhD was in community and regional planning from the University of British Columbia. And it was, his doctoral dissertation was this subject of an ecological footprint. So I will now turn it over to him and give him his T-shirt. The T-shirt is made out of unbleached, organically grown cotton and was made in a worker-friendly factory.
Thank you so much. I got the prize already, so I can leave, I think. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope it will be an intimate conversation about our future. And what I hope actually as a focus is not just kind of to have it interesting, but really to build some skills. Because many times I remember I gave lectures and people say, oh, how interesting, and then it was just another interesting things among the volcanoes and why airplanes fly. And so I hope to transcend that a little bit and actually so you can leave with some skills. And the main things will be summarized on a little leaflet that we produced for the World Summit on Sustainable Development, where I just went to and took 6,000 of those around to hand out. And so this will be the concentrated wisdom of today, I hope. So the focus of the skills will be how can we actually accelerate sustainability? Being a little bit sharper on the concept, because many people say, oh, sustainability, anybody has a definition, doesn't really mean anything. But actually, as we will move through the lecture, I think there are some measurable, basic conditions that we need to meet and we're not meeting today. That doesn't mean once we meet them we're sustainable, but they're necessary conditions for sustainability. But before I start, I also have something unbleached, organically grown in what would they say?
Worker-friendly.
Worker-friendly and even fair trade. Because I just came back from Switzerland on my way back, where I'm from. I grew up in Switzerland, and I picked up unbleached organic chocolate. And so I thought I would like to share that with you to show Swiss generosity. That's why the Swiss are so rich, because we are incredibly generous. So here. And actually it's part of the speakers union process, because the spaces in front are never filled. So we kind of give a little extra gift to people who dare to sit a little bit closer to me. So next time everybody will be sitting here. Okay. 10 years ago with the Rio conference in Rio de Janeiro, many in the sustainability community, we got very excited about the possibility actually of sustainability capturing the global audience. And 10 years later, sustainable development even made it into the title of the conference, because 10 years ago it was called Environment Development. But now in Johannesburg, actually the conference was called World Summit, not for, perhaps next time they call it for, it was called World Summit on Sustainable Development. So that was very exciting. At the same time, some frustrations lingered in the way of saying, how come it's such a beautiful idea that now we're talking about these issues, but we cannot be specific about it. As long as we cannot be specific about it, we won't be able to make progress. In the same way, if you're not able to have an observable research question in science, you will not be able to produce a result that actually holds more than hot air. You know, so basically just think of observable as something that you can capture perhaps with a video camera. You know, a video camera can hear or record something. That's something observable rather than just a loose interpretation that we not necessarily can agree upon. So how can we make sustainability more how can we make the process towards sustainability more accountable, more trackable, more measurable? And essentially what we felt was necessary to say there are some underlying basic conditions for sustainability that are actually observable. Namely, do we live within the capacity of the planet? You know, that's a basic necessary condition. Now, living within the carrying capacity is not necessarily enough, because there also needs to be, people also need to live well. There needs to be some equity and justice and peace. We need to use resources in a way that we don't degrade them. You know? So there are lots of details to be worked out, but there is this basic question of saying, are we living within the capacity of the planet? Now, if you look at ecological supply, how much supply do we actually have on the planet? That's a fairly easy question to answer. In the most simple unit, in the unit of number of planets available, you know, the answer would be 1. So we have 1 planet that is ecologically productive, that provides all of our resources. It's powered by the sun. And if actually we take a step further and look at the distribution of how much of it actually provides most of our living resources, we will find out, if we look at some geography books, that roughly a quarter of the planet's surface harbors most of the biocapacity on which we depend. In other words, on this piece of land and on this piece of sea, most of the resources such as fish, food, fiber, is being regenerated. Now on the rest of the planet, it's not lifeless. Life has penetrated in each corner of the world. Everywhere there is life. Even on Antarctica there is life. But it's not as dense as on this rest of the planet. Now for people who grew up in the metric system, actually, with these few facts, they can calculate how much capacity there is per person. The meter, or the kilometer was defined as 1/40,000th part of the equator. That was just the way the French said, let's define the kilometer, and then went around the world, measured, and said, okay, 40,000 will be the 1 kilometer. And so if you know a little bit of geometry, you can actually calculate the surface of the planet. And once you divide that by the quarter, then you get the sense of how much productive space there is on this planet. Now you can even go a step further, looking up some statistics on how many people live on the planet right now. 6 billion people say, and that may not be very precise. I mean, there was a census in the United States just about 2 years ago, and I think the census found 5 million more people than they expected. So it's not that easy to count people, but we know probably it's not 5 billion, probably it's not 7 billion, so it's in that range. So let's just assume about 6 billion. And then when you look at what does that mean on a per capita basis, how much ecological capacity do we have right now on the planet? Roughly, that adds up to 4.5 acres of ecological productive space. Just as a reference point, if you look at the football field, like the white field, the white land field, that's about 1 acre large. So that's what we have. That's the budget. Now, that's just the average. There's just a mathematical average. There is a slight complication, though. Not just that as population numbers change, obviously this number will change. If we double in population, then there will be half the amount available per person. That's one part. The other complication is that we are just one species. There are 1.4 million species documented. They have a Latin or a Greek name, and they're written down in a book or somewhere in a scientific paper. So 1.4 million species have a name. We are one species. There may be about 8 million species that exist on the planet but haven't been found yet. Probably smaller beetles and worms in the Amazon, but mainly beetles. God was most generous with beetles, apparently. So then we should ask ourselves, okay, just for our sustainable world, how much of the ecological capacity should we actually leave for other species? And to a large extent, that's an ethical question. I mean, some conservation biologists may help to point out some absolute limitations. For example, in Europe, where I'm from, most of the biodiversity, I mean, that basically in order to maintain the biodiversity that made it into the 20th century, you don't need that much space, because in Europe we have used the space very extensively already. So it may be that with 5% of the area set aside in Europe, we may be able to maintain the singing bird populations that have maintained themselves into the 20th century. But in other areas like the Amazon forest, that is very dense and diverse in biodiversity, we may need much larger parts in order to maintain biodiversity. Then we also may want to say, actually, from a landscape perspective, how much do we actually want to leave wild? It's our choice. So we can say, okay, how much should it be? And if we, for example, assume, just for mathematical reasons, because it's simple, if we say, let's leave half for other species, then that would mean per capita, the budget would be roughly 2.2 or 2.25 acres per person. That's what exists on the planet. So we can become very specific. We can say sustainability, essentially. Sustainability means how can we all live well? Because people want to live well. Sustainability in its essence is a very anthropocentric concept, in essence, is how can we make sure people can live well forever, for a long period of time? How can we all live well within this budget of 2.25 acres? So that's really the big challenge, and I think that's the main research question that should drive not just academic institutions, but also governments and international banks, UN, or you name it. That's really the research question we need to address in order to maintain sustainability. Now, again, this is just a basic necessary condition. If you have 2.25 acres available as budget on average, there are some things that need to be phased out. There are some activities that are by nature inherently unsustainable. For example, spreading plutonium. There's no ecological capacity, no meaningful ecological capacity to cope with accumulating plutonium. So some things need to be phased out. So in other words, there are some activities that are inherently unsustainable that need to be phased out, that we don't want in our garden. On the other hand, we can also say there's no inherently sustainable activity. Those that are not inherently unsustainable, we have to find out how much of those can the Earth tolerate. Let me give you an example. Many people may think, let's say, horses are sustainable. Now, if everybody on the planet had about 200 horses, there just wouldn't be enough planet to feed all the horses. Apparently, I just saw a statistic. Today, there are about 10% more horses than there were in 1890. It's kind of interesting. Anyhow, small statistic, just not that meaningful, but surprising. Okay, so let's go back to what I said so far, because the only thing I said was how much budget do we have on the planet. And the point I would like to underline is what the assumptions were behind these 2.25 acres. Or let's just take one step back, behind the 4.5 acres. They say, okay, that's just one assumption, it's just one model. Yeah, it's just one model. But let me give you the assumptions, and you can find out with which ones you don't agree. We have one planet in human reach. The equator spans 40,000 kilometers. 1/4 of the area of the planet is biologically productive. That means covers most of the forests, the farmland, there where we can find green stuff, the productive areas of the sea. And then that we are roughly 6 billion people. Well, if you agree with these assumptions, then you get the budget. So pretty straightforward. Now let's move to a less straightforward part of the equation. We talked about the supply. Let's look at the demand. How much of this budget do we actually depend on, or do we use right now? And that's what we call the ecological footprint. The ecological footprint is an accounting tool in some ways similar to a GDP. It just looks at what is happening. It looks at what is happening in terms of our ecological demand on nature. It says, okay, in order to provide our food, how much space do we need in terms of cropland, pasture, productive sea space? And then in addition to that, we need areas to produce paper, wood, fiber for our clothes, unbleached organic cotton needs space. In addition, we need space to accommodate our urban infrastructures. Most cities are built on the most productive land because settlements start where it's easy to have agriculture. So most of the best land is already paved over. We need additional space to absorb waste. Actually, in our global accounts, I will show you, we didn't include that because there's very poor data available on waste and its impact on biocapacity. Then the last piece is energy. Energy uses space. For example, hydropower obviously uses space, but also fossil fuel uses space, because our research question is, how much bioproductive area is necessary to maintain the flow of our resources, to maintain our demand on the resources. Now, in terms of fossil fuel, you can answer it from different perspectives. You can say, actually, the most significant limitation is the sink side. There's not enough capacity there to cope with the waste. That's why there's so much talk about climate change. Now, how much area, how much bigger would the planet need to be in order to stabilize the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere? So that basically would allow to maintain the flow, assuming there's plenty of source or plenty of oil in the ground, just assuming how much area would we need to have to actually cope from the waste side. That gives you an area. Another way of calculating it would be to say, okay, how much bigger would the world need to be in order to provide, so that nature could provide us the energy on a renewable basis? Both obviously come out with about the same area because it's the same carbon cycle. You know, you need the same energy to absorb the CO2 out of the atmosphere as that is being captured in biomass that you can burn again. So it's not surprising. That gives you also an aerial demand. Now I would say again, why is this an underestimate of our demand on nature? Various reasons. One is because many of the pollutants we don't have data for, we don't actually include. Those activities that are inherently unsustainable, that need to be phased out, we don't include in the footprint either. That just need to be phased out. We just look at the areas that are the area necessary for those activities that are potentially sustainable. So by adding this up, we get an estimate of our demand on nature. And now, how does it look like? What's the result? We just published in the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences a time series globally of saying, okay, let's look at the last 40 years. What was the supply and what was the demand? The supply of number of planets was actually surprisingly constant. I don't remember from before because I wasn't born, but since I'm born, we have about one planet. Now, important is to remember that this planet is actually different every year. The ecosystem composition is changing. Technology is changing, so we use resources at different efficiencies. In some cases less efficiently, in some cases more efficiently. For example, the car efficiencies in the United States is going down on average, not up, in spite of technological advancement. And then we can compare this supply of one planet with the demand in every year. So every year we compare the demand of resources with that particular planet of that year, with that particular technology of that year. So it's always a comparison of that year's planet with that year's consumption. And what we see as a first estimate is that in 1960 we used roughly 0.7 planets. What does that mean? It means it would have taken 0.7 years to regenerate the resources that we consumed within that 1 year. By the year 2002, we are using about 25% more than what the planet can regenerate. In other words, it would take 1 year and 3 months to regenerate what we use in 1 year. Let me give you an example. We can cut forests more rapidly than they regenerate. You know, if we would cut forests at double the sustainable rate, then this overshoot or this overdraw would be double from that line. Does that make sense? So a forest may grow at 2% a year, as an example. Roughly that may be about the right amount. So if we cut 4% of the biomass, you know, then we would take double. It's not very visible in the first year. So we can dip into the capital. There's no warning light here that tells us, oh, now we're taking more than what you use. It's not getting more difficult to push the chainsaw through the wood as you cut down the forest, as you move into unsustainable harvest. It's not more difficult to push the CO2 out of your exhaust pipe as the concentration in the atmosphere of CO2 is increasing. It is getting a little bit more difficult to get fish in a depleting fishery, so there is some feedback there. And fisheries are probably among the more unstable or less robust, among the least robust parts of natural capital. Forests may take overuse for quite a while. Fisheries then can collapse quite quickly. So it's not each part of natural capital works exactly the same. So in some ways, we can't exactly equate natural capital with financial capital, but still there are similar phenomena happening. As with financial capital, if you live beyond the interest, you start to dip into the capital. You start to liquidate your assets. Now, I showed this curve, this graph, to a friend of mine who has worked for a long time on sustainability, and asked her, what do you think? She looked at it for a very long time, didn't say anything. So I said, what do you think? She said, holy shit. So they're calling it now the holy shit graph. But actually, holy shit is just one possible interpretation. It's just the way how you react. This is just the way it is, like GDP. That's how many dollars are spending are not being spent in an economy. So what? So we make a story. What does it mean? And actually, as we published this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we did two things in order to get the media's attention. One was to have a very simple title, because most of the titles in scientific papers are very hard to understand. They have Greek symbols in there, like alpha spin of whatever, proton, whatever, and then you're not sure, is it something about quantum physics or is it about genetic engineering? Anyhow, so we had a very simple title. We said, Tracking the Ecological Overshoot of the Human Economy. So that was pretty obvious. And then we had this very simple graph in there, probably the most simple graph ever published in a science paper. Number of planets, 1 over time. Okay, but we got it in after a lot of struggles. And so the journalist called me and said, so isn't that a doomsday scenario? And I would actually say, no, I don't think so. I mean, it's a good news story from my perspective. And that's my story. You may not buy the story, but I think it's a good news story because finally the mail is working again and we're getting our bank statements. Before we didn't know where we were at. Now we can take the fate in our hands and say, okay, how do you want to live? Because yes, for some time we can exceed carrying capacity. For some time we can be an overshoot. For some time we can spend more than what we earn. Many of you are going to school, so that's a time when we spend sometimes more than what we earn. But it's an investment into the future, and so you're preparing for another future. Now, if collectively as humanity we take a similar attitude and say, okay, we didn't do too well, we see a problem, but let's use this time to invest in a future where we don't have to live on liquidating our assets, then we can move out of this situation. So it's, in some ways, I would say you can look at it as a good news story, or you can call it holy shit graph. And perhaps it's both. It's both. So, but it's our choice. So basically, just the way it is. Now, we actually worked with WWF, who won against WWF in keeping WWF as its logo. So the wrestlers against the ones that wrestle with world problems. So it's the World Wide Fund for Nature International. We are helping them with the Living Planet report, which essentially tries to answer the exact question. They're saying, okay, overall, how are we doing on this planet? To what extent is the living planet being threatened? Are we doing well? So the essence of the report is actually in these two graphs. The lower one we just discussed. How many planets does it take? Now 1.2 planets. And at the same time, what we see as an effect is the following, which is called the Living Planet Index, put together by WWF, which is a measure, a simplified measure perhaps, of the health of wild natural capital. And the way it's calculated is quite simple. It looks at on average, the population size of wild species. So it's not the number of species that exist, but it's the population size of species and how they develop over time. So from an index of 100 in 1970, we are now down at an index of 70, meaning on average, let's say, the elephant population that was 100 individuals is now 70 individuals. Now that doesn't hold exactly for elephants, because elephants have done much worse over the last 30 years, particularly in Asia. But then other species have done better. Canada geese, for example, are more plentiful now than they were 30 years ago. So this is just the average of the 750 species for which there are some data available overall. Yes, there may be a certain bias because biologists probably look more at large animals or animals that are more under threat, or more birds because there are lots of birders. So yes, it's not the exact representation, but it's the first indication of a random sample of animal species. And this is exactly what for example, in the natural step language, which is another way of looking at sustainability, they call the funnel. The fact that actually, you see this is similarity, human demands are going up at the same time as ecological capacity is going down. Now, interestingly enough, this story, or these two stories, are often presented as contradictions. The famous and now late economist Julian Simon, for example, said, look at the data. Life is getting better all the time. People are living longer lives in the United States. We have more material wealth. We have been able to build water treatment plants. Water is of higher quality today than it was some time ago in the United States, etc. So there are lots of indications that things are getting better. What's all that scary, At the same time, we have environmentalists, conservationists pointing out all environmental problems, from water scarcity to fishery collapses to, let's say, ozone depletion, stratospheric ozone depletion. And really the point of the story is that both are right at the same time. We can have great parties on a diminishing natural capital, because these lines actually can intersect. We can use more than what nature can regenerate. That's what overshoot is all about. So to use the party analogy again, you're not limited, but if you start to liquidate your assets, the parties don't necessarily get smaller. The party only stops once you have used up all the capital. So, in other ways, this is another way of explaining the same story of overshoot, which I think is at the core of sustainability, why it's so hard to move forward on it, because it's not that visible. Because overshoot allows you to exceed limits without feeling anything. There's no warning sign, there's no hard wall, there's no crash, and still we're using more. In the most primitive way, we could say it's sustainable if we live on the interest of the capital, or if we see the world very romantically as a bucket that is being replenished by solar energy. The excess that is being produced is what we can sustainably harvest. What we do today is we use technology to access these resources at ever faster rate. Now, it doesn't mean technology always has to deplete natural capital. Technology, I think, needs to be part of the solution of a sustainable world. But the technology that we choose today predominantly is the one that makes it easier for us to access resources using fewer hours. So that's the technology that we choose predominantly. And that includes things like internet, that makes it easy to shop things from far away, at lower cost. We don't have to go around, so we can, it makes us easier to compare prices all over the country. Currency convertibility, for example, that the euro emerged in Europe, reduces the cost of trading between different countries if you have just one currency. Communication networks, that we can call up Brazil and say, send us some, teak wood or whatever. So technology is very widespread in helping us accessing resources more rapidly. Well, let me just give you another example of from friends of mine who got a house in Wisconsin to rent very cheaply because the renters before used parts of the house to heat the house. Now, that works very well as long as you don't run out of house before you run out of winter, you know? But then there may be a second winter coming, etc., so the rents get cheaper. But essentially, that's really a symbol of the confusion we have today between true production and liquidation. That even, I mean, in the oil business, we call it oil production, while actually not much is being produced. Producing oil, to me, looks much more like taking money out of a safe, you know. Few people would call that earning money, you know. Perhaps bank robbers call it earning money, but few other professions call it earning money. So really, that's I think that's what makes sustainability so difficult. That the distinction between income and liquidation are very blurry. So by having accounts, by not flying blind, we can actually take charge of our situation. That's what the ecological footprint is all about. It's like a business that says, let's save some money, you know, let's get rid of all these accountants, you know. They're not productive, they're just kind of sitting there putting numbers together. So what's the impact on the company? Most likely it's going bankrupt. And I think the same thing we could predict for our world economy. You know, if we don't have serious accounts that tell us how much nature there is as compared to how much nature we depend on or we use, we're preparing for ecological bankruptcy. That's really the bottom line. So the ecological footprint is not just a moral stick of saying, be nice. You know, it's much more, it's a tool to help us protect our assets. It's an asset protection tool. Helps us to make sustainability very simple, and that's why I also passed around the chocolate. How many of you actually got some chocolate? You see, how do the people feel that didn't get chocolate? You know? So I mean, that's just a small point. This is how to translate everything in chocolate language, because I like chocolate and it's more memorable. That essentially, you know, people like chocolate, and most people would like a piece of it, you know, so that's the quality of life side. Everybody would like a piece of chocolate, but there's only so much chocolate. You know, there's so much budget. And people could say, 2 chocolates would be better, and that's true, you know. Unfortunately, we have 1 planet. Apart from here, we have 10, but that's just for today. So it's a special sale. Starting tomorrow, we'll have only 1 planet. Okay, so that was the global situation that we looked at. Let me just move a scale down. Actually, I have a few living planet reports here, but would have to charge you a little bit for it, but these are free, and they have most of the information on it too, where you can just compare 150 countries on how much capacity do they demand. It doesn't show how much capacity they have. It just shows worldwide the average. But so here, just a sample of countries in acres. Say, okay, how much capacity do, on average, Italians need, the world need? So here we see this discrepancy that we use about 20-25% more than what there is per person worldwide. And then we can also say, okay, if everybody lived, let's say, the lifestyle of Germany, you know, we wouldn't leave anything for other species. How many planets would it take? So it's quite a simple exercise, because what we do is we see that's what we have, leaving nothing for other species. We compare it with 12, you know, being taken, so that's a factor of 3 roughly. You know. And so we're very happy actually that this is now being recognized even by the economists. So if it's in the economists, it must be true. And so they basically, as their WSSD, the World Summit on Sustainable Development preparation piece on their survey on the global environment, had this on the picture, basically answering, using our research and saying, how many planets does it take? 3. So what, Let's look at the good news story here. Just north of San Francisco is Marin County, one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. And it was interesting, actually, that people in Marin County want to live like in Italy. They want to have cute little piazzas in the middle of the city where they have nice coffee shops where they can sit and have their coffee, and the pizzeria on the way home, and chat with each other, have markets there, walk around. And actually on holidays they fly thousands of miles to go to Italy and walk around during the evenings, in all the towns. That's their entertainment, walk around town, and everybody watches each other. So they fly thousands of kilometers to watch each other walk around and have a good time. So the good news is really, if you look at the Italian footprint, it's kind of the idol of high quality of life, Dolce Vita. They can do it on 9 acres per person. And some people would argue they have a higher quality of life than many in the United States, more communities. And these 9 acres have been achieved without putting all Italian ingenuity into how can we design cities that have a small footprint. It just happened this way. It's a historic coincidence, an ancillary benefit that they could amplify if they actually also would include footprint thinking. And actually there are many Italian cities that have taken on footprints to see how big are their footprints and are working with it. It's kind of interesting. I wouldn't have expected Italy would jump on it first among many countries. But it's interesting to see how much difference you can produce, so what scale of difference there is, and that's not yet the final destination, because obviously that wouldn't be sufficient worldwide as a model, but it shows the potential. Now let me move on. Now I get a little bit more banky, so I may lose some people here, but interestingly enough, actually, it was a bank in Switzerland that approached us about these results. They started to get very interested, because what they started to recognize is that looking at the world from an ecological footprint perspective gives you some insight about risks that otherwise are hidden. So it's a tool it helps to see risk exposures of countries. And the argument is quite simple. They say countries that use more capacity than what they have within their own boundaries will increasingly face a liability. Today, the liability may not be as strong yet because we can still externalize so many costs. We can still put CO2 in the atmosphere for free, but that may not be the case as much in the future. Kyoto is coming, and there will be stronger agreements probably following Kyoto, and even if the United States is not part formally of Kyoto, it will have impacts on the United States because other countries may put trade tariffs on American goods, and so there will be some pressure to also bring the United States into such agreements. So anyhow, ecological services will become more expensive in the future. In addition, the world will be scarcer in the future, so increasingly so, ecological deficits will be a liability that are not fully recognized yet in banking assessments of long-term credit ratings. And so when we did some initial analysis that we published in a small booklet with the Swiss bank, what emerged was the following, and I won't go into too much detail, but just give you a gist of how we can use this kind of analysis in ways that even I wouldn't have expected. It was the banks who came and said, hey, there's something to learn from these numbers. Essentially what we plotted one against each other is the competitiveness index as defined by the World Economic Forum, or also known as the Davos Forum. That's where all the jet setters meet in January. And face some demonstrations sometimes. And basically, what they compare is how competitive are these different countries? How many telephones do they have? Do people strike? Are they well educated? All these kinds of things. And so that's really the main thing. And then we compare that with ecological deficit, or to put it in a positive way, the ecological remainder. How much capacity do countries still have to decide over as compared to the one that is already allocated for footprints? So If your footprint is already larger, it becomes a deficit. If your footprint is smaller than your own capacity, then obviously you have some remainder. And the interesting thing, one of the interesting things we found is that there are very few countries that are not competitive, but still have some extra capacity. In other words, it seems to be easier to be competitive if you have capacity left. You know, it's actually, if you have stuff around in your house, it's easier to do stuff. That's basically the argument. And if you look at the countries that didn't make it for the competitiveness, even though they have ecological capacity, they are mainly hindered by social constraints, like social violent conflicts. Let's look at like Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Argentina's in here too. So it doesn't explain everything, but it shows that it's an additional factor in risk exposure today. So that makes governments more interested. Another way of how it's emerging and making a difference is that it has been taken up by many international reports. For example, this North American Environment Report just coming out a month ago heavily relied on the ecological footprint to look at consumption trends in the United States and Canada, showing how many plants it would take to, if everybody imitated our lifestyles. Or the United Nations Food and Population, the United Nations Population Fund, actually in their most recent report, also built the whole framework on the footprint, saying there's only so much capacity. How can we live well on this planet? So before we get into more discussion, which I would like to see as a centerpiece of our evening, let me just summarize in why is it useful to know about your ecological footprint. Obviously, it helps us to set very simple targets. And again, living within capacity or having a footprint smaller than your capacity is just a necessary condition, it's not a sufficient one. However, for example, in the urban planning field where I'm out of, I haven't really seen a vision yet of people saying, that's how we have to build cities in the future so they fit on the planet. So we are in a situation right now, and that's a challenge to you students, where even the visionaries today are not able to produce visions that meet minimum conditions. You know, normally visions or utopias should go beyond, but now the visions that we know of so far don't reach the necessary conditions. That doesn't mean it's not possible. I'm just saying we haven't really put that question at the core of our research endeavors. So here it's a big challenge. How can we, should we have an international competition perhaps, on saying the Missoula competition, you know, on which architectural firm, which academic institution can create a plan for a city that actually operates for food, transportation, housing, all the basic needs on these 4.5 acres, or probably less, if you have larger populations, even less. Let's say on 2 acres. I actually have a friend of mine, he calls himself a wise acre, coming from the East Coast, and he says, okay, that's the biggest challenge, you know. Lindbergh flew over the Atlantic, you know, and Picard flew with the balloon around the Earth, and then how is he called, the guy who did it actually alone, the American, remember? Foster, yeah, Foster. Done, you know. We flew on the moon, done. Now the big question is, how can we live on 1 acre? You know, how can we live well on 1 acre? That's the big question. That's where we should have a big trophy. Now the problem with a big trophy would be, if you get too big of a trophy, then perhaps the person wouldn't live on 1 acre anymore afterwards. So there's a bit of a challenge. But nevertheless, I think that's really the biggest intellectual challenge and human challenge we are facing. So we can set some very specific targets. The targets don't tell us yet what we need to do, and I think that's actually the strength of such accounts. Like the GDP doesn't really tell you what you need to do for an economic policy. It just says that's what is. It gives you a reference point. So in the same way, the footprint accounts just tell you that's the budget, and then we can start to play. So they're very similar to a white line around a football field. They just say, That's the boring part, you know, that's how big the football field is. But without the lines, you cannot play. So the interesting part is finding out what we can do. And essentially there are 4 intervention points, and perhaps this, sometimes people think this graphic it looks cute, but it's ununderstandable. So listen to my words, then look at the picture, perhaps, I don't know. We have 4 essential intervention points. And some people here in environmental studies feel they may remember the IPAT equation. Essentially, just a way of organizing our impact. And we say, okay, essentially, if we want to reduce our demand on nature by half, we have 4 possibilities of doing it. Let's say 3.5. Let's start with the 3. We can, everything else stays the same. We can have half the population size. Everything stays the same. We can just have half the consumption per capita. Everything stays the same. We can just have double the technological efficiency to get services out of resources. And the last part, which doesn't work as exactly, but it's actually, is investing in the biosphere or in ecosystem management. So actually, it's more robust to human intervention. One example is Forest Stewardship Council ways of certifying forests, so forests aren't getting overused. So it's like a fuse, like electric fuse against overusing ecosystems, so you can secure ecosystems from this overwhelming global demand that is just grabbing what it can from being depleted. So, in other ways, let me just repeat: we can make the world more robust to human impact. We can become better at getting resources, you know, so better management. Then we can produce the goods and services using fewer resources, and then we can reduce our overall consumption, which has 2 parts: how many people are consuming, how much are we consuming per person. And obviously there's also a strong social equity piece in it, because some people do need larger footprints. Some people alive today need larger footprints. So that just makes it then even more of a challenge for those who have larger footprints to reduce their part if we want to live within budget. And that's our choice. So I don't want to use the word should ever today, and if I said should already, then I apologize. I just say, if we want to be sustainable, then we should, if we want to be, if we want to be sustainable, live within the budget of nature. You know, that's, so choose. So it's not a should, yeah. If we want to be sustainable, don't use more. Yeah, it may be an effective way of doing it may be not to use more than the budget. It's your choice. Yeah. To finish, 2 points. Footprint thinking also helps us to see the larger picture. In one way, it gives us a framework to distinguish between inherently unsustainable activities that don't have a footprint because they need to be phased out. There's no regenerative capacity on the planet. And then for those activities that are potentially sustainable, to find out, is there enough space on the planet? And to do that actually in a way that looks at the whole context. We call it the bed cover effect. And it's very simple. If you have a bed cover that is small, but a night that is cold, you know, you want to cover your head because you have a cold head, you will get cold feet. You know? So that's a bed cover that is just maybe not enough to cover you all. In the same way, if we solve problems just by displacing pressure, the problem is not really solved, it's just displaced. So let me give you an example. If we believe we can produce more fish protein through fish farming, but actually the fish farm are fed with other fish and with agricultural products, then overall the pressure will increase, because typically to produce 1 calorie of food from a fish farm, you feed them with at least 4 or 5 calories of food. So it's actually, you're losing 3 to 4 per kilo produced. Does that make sense? So this is a way of seeing, is the overall impact, does it reduce it or does it increase it? It's actually very interesting when Lowe's announced that they would not use old growth timber any longer from the northwest, or from the northwest, or from British Columbia. And very soon after that, the Dogwood Alliance in southern United States was very worried because they recognized that if the demand stays constant, there will just be more pressures on their forests. So it's a very real reallocation that is happening in a global economy. Wouldn't happen as much in a bioregional economy. So let me just summarize with a story. Why is it useful to have good measures? There's one town in Florida called Key West that made its living by putting fake beacons on in the wrong locations. So ships would go aground because they mistook the beacon for another one. And so they very generously went out to the ship to help them unload their cargo for a small fee. So they got very rich very quickly and they built a thriving economy because there were many ships passing by. Today, they're still doing well because they invested their money and have a nice little town. So now it's a tourist town. Tourists come there and spend their money. So everything is fine. Now, the problem is that we seem to be doing a similar thing. We run our economy looking at the wrong lighthouses. Or we put lighthouses that say, GDP is up, everything must be fine. But actually, we may be very much depleting our natural assets on which to depend. The only difference is that most likely there won't be as many tourists coming and visiting us in the future to maintain our economies, because most planets are still rather far away and may not have as much tourist potential for us as we may hope. So the point really is, measurements help us. Measurements need to be reliable as the lighthouses, so we can steer a course towards a future that we choose. Ecological footprints are not just a stick of saying, oh, things are really bad. Rather, it gives us choice to protect our assets. And the same way as a soccer field has a white line around it, it gives us the context within which to play. And that's really why I'm here, to initiate a game with you, and I'm looking forward to the interactions we'll be having right now, back and forth. Thank you so much. Should we just take questions? Yes.
Making our lives more sustainable, like you said, our cars are becoming less fuel efficient, et cetera, et cetera. How do you propose that we implement or enforce these kind of ideas of sustainable living on people?
Everybody heard the question. How do we impose sustainable living on our people in the situation of the possible Iraq war that may be linked to oil interests? How do we bring sustainability forward? I think one of the problems is that many people don't recognize the cost of unsustainable living. Don't recognize that actually we are destroying our own ecological assets. So our small contribution in this direction may not be enough, but our small contribution is to highlight the cost of destroying our own ecological assets. And I think that's not recognized at this point. It's just at a small point. Essentially, what we try to do is appeal to the enlightened self-interest. And one conversation we'll be having soon is with rating companies. now just going beyond banks, rating companies like S&P or Moody's that are actually telling which country has which kind of a credit worthiness in the long run. It's a very small audience that puts attention to these numbers, but it's a very influential audience, like national governments and large investment banks. And if we are able to include this kind of thinking in their rating, there will be much more sensitivity to these issues, we hope. So it's a small step in getting people's attention. Does that address your issues? Mm-hmm. And then, so I think every time we're not able to impose sustainable lifestyles on others. I think that's the part. We have to be able to find ways that actually people feel they have a better life by taking on sustainability in some way or another. That doesn't necessarily mean that it means materially more, but that they are materially better off necessarily in a very limited sense, but they have a better life experience. They feel more secure. But we have to be able to make that case. And I think a core to it is that people can choose. Again, trying to avoid the word should, but people will see that they can choose, they can be the heroes, and they will be better off in some ways. And I don't mean that in a very limited material way, but just they feel more happy in their community, they feel better towards their grandchildren and children. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
I was curious if the ecological equation took into account the ways in which we remove some of our productive land, such as oil spills or pollution spills, or how, and if you knew at all, the percentage of that productive land that was being taken out each year from those accidents, whatever you call them.
The question was, to what extent the ecological footprint accounts reflect loss of ecological capacity due to oil exploration, oil spills, mining, and pollution. Actually, they don't, because numbers are very hard to find that actually reliably show how much capacity is being lost. If you look at even very, very basic assets like forests or grazing land, there's no consistent database worldwide that shows how much ecological capacity exists. So it's quite spotty. The best data that exists we use is from the Food and Agriculture Organization. It's a UN organization. But most of the numbers, particularly about grazing, forest, and fisheries, is highly political because quotas are set on how much you can harvest, and so there are strong political and economic interests to fudge with these numbers. Even if you want to know globally how much land is being urbanized, the numbers vary tremendously. One reason is that satellites have a hard time to pick up small objects like houses and then add them up into a surface. So it's quite surprising. It's particularly surprising why we know so little about forest and grazing capacity, because if you think about it, I mean, that's really the underlying asset for many countries. I don't say we should graze all the land, but it gives us an idea of how much cattle we actually can have as a maximum in a country. So a much more important asset than the gold you have in a bank that doesn't really produce anything, and we're starting to get rid of because it's just kind of it's not very necessary as a counterweight to the paper money. So as a much more important asset would be to know how much biological capacity you have in your country, but there's no country that has a systematic account of their ecological assets, and that's, I think, quite scary. So I mean, that's what I also see. The positive part of it is it's a motivation for governments to say ecological assets really matter, so we should have such accounts, and which will lead to a conversation about that ecological limits really matter, and if we don't look at them, we'll be destroying our opportunities for the future. Yes.
I'm not sure. It sounds like you focus your footprint on biologically productive spaces. You also sometimes focus on water sources.
Yeah. Water is probably a more important liquid even than fossil fuel, as many people point out, and it has led and will lead to even more even violent conflicts in the future. So water is an essential ingredient. It is hard to put in the ecological footprint accounts for the following reason. Very often, water is a secondary service from an area of land. So, for example, we may use one area of land for timber production, at the same time get the water. So counting the water too would be double counting, so we would exaggerate our demand on nature. Still, what we have done in order to just roughly get a sense of how much capacity actually is linked to overuse of water, we have compared irrigation water or the capacity that we get from irrigation to overall biocapacity to get a sense how fragile the biocapacity actually is that we calculate. So in some countries, for example, the United States, roughly, just looking at the whole irrigation, particularly in the West, we calculated about 8% of the total biocapacity could be phantom capacity built on just transitional irrigation. And transitional in the sense that we may not be able to maintain this irrigation practice for more than 100 years. Yeah?
Say we want to get real aggressive and proactive for reducing our ecological footprint. What would be the best leverage point in terms of some of the areas that you described, the energy, materials, to focus on?
In industrialized countries, the easiest way to reduce footprints massively is through energy use. And there are two parts of it. One is substituting the fossil fuel with energy resources that are much less energy intensive. So what's the most efficient solar technology, for example, that people invented? What do you think? What's the most, pardon? Passive solar, actually even more efficient. Yeah, even more efficient. Yeah, grass we didn't invent, but we can use. I would say it's the laundry line, you know, because it's just one string, and it harvests enormous amount of wind and solar energy to dry your clothes as compared to using a dryer, for example. So anyhow, so in that case, you have a reduction of probably factor 1 million, I don't know, or 100,000, I don't know, for just drying clothes. But then others are hard. Other like windmills may still be a factor 100 decrease of footprint per unit of energy consumed. But then we can't produce all the energy we consume with windmill because wind energy fluctuates, so it only can perhaps provide about 30% of the electricity consumption that we use. So there's some limits to how much wind energy we can use. So one thing is, how do we substitute fossil fuel? And the second part is, how do we organize ourselves in a way that we don't need as much energy? And perhaps the most significant decision for the future on energy consumption is the way we build our infrastructures. Now, the way they are built, they're actually enormous resource traps that they force us for a rather long future, because we can't just rebuild infrastructure over the next year or two. They force us for a long period of time to have very resource-intensive lifestyles that we may not be able to afford. So that's the conservation side, but actually it's very much built into the way we organize our infrastructure. Yeah?
In a wartime economy, when you're figuring, when you assign a value for something like an esoteric thing like peace, that is pursued as a...
What's the footprint of peace? Or yeah, are you asking what would be the footprint of peace? Or yeah, okay. The ecological footprint is just a very simplistic, human-centered, fragmentary way of adding up the resources, as if the world is just a pile of resources and to find out how we should use them. So it's a minimum condition for sustainability, but not the full sustainability equation. So it just says we should live within this budget. That's a minimum condition. Now we can do incredibly stupid things with this budget. It's like with money. We have so much money, then you can do incredibly stupid things, or we can do actually wonderful things. So that's for us to choose how we use our budget best. So what I provide is just a budgeting tool, like for money, that allows us to protect our assets, and then we need to bring our ingenuity together to use it in the best way. So probably, I mean, we could use our ecological capacity to wage war. Probably not the best way of doing it then. Does that address your question? No.
It's hard to say.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, the answer is it does not look at human values. It doesn't. Having a small footprint doesn't mean you will have a happy life. It just means that's the budget you have. Now, finding out how we can have the happiest life on this budget, that's a big challenge. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know where I found exactly, but on the internet there's some detailed ecological footprints that you can fill out.
Yeah.
And I've been really successful using that with students, and what I've found is that travel has been a huge contributor to our ecological footprint. Using those models, I don't know if there's the 12 or 13 step ones, but there's also more detailed ones.
Mm-hmm.
You can play around and figure out, well, if I don't eat meat for a year versus don't fly that east for 2 times, and how can I realistically, kind of in response to Betsy's question, significantly cut down my footprint, and maybe you can
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you want to find out about your own ecological footprint, you can go to the website myfootprint.org, and there's some simple questions. In the future, we'd like to build it out actually, and you can play through scenarios of what it means. Now it's a bit static. You just get a result, and then you can play it again and see what happens if I fly less or drive more or whatever. In my case too, flying is more than half of my footprint. So coming here for 2 days is absurd. I mean, the interesting thing is actually per mile, driving a car on your own, actually quite a compact car, or flying, has about the same energy consumption overall. But obviously, I couldn't just drive here for 2 days. I wouldn't do that. So just the sheer ability that you can get so far in so short periods of time, even though it's energy efficient, increases resource consumption incredibly. And that's an interesting lesson for the whole efficiency idea, that actually efficiency very often is compensated by increased consumption. So we have to combine technological efficiency with things like tax shifts that we at Redefining Progress also have worked on. How can we tax waste rather than work, So how can we tax efficiency gains to the benefit of society? So we don't just use the efficiency gains to consume more, but actually to redirect into investing into natural capital. More questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here and
I go in Johannesburg as far as I didn't make it to South America for the sustainable development thing, but did Colin Powell take this well, or did you get to talk to him at all?
Yeah, the highest level delegate I was able to talk to was Christy Todd Whitman. But it was actually one of the interesting lessons from Johannesburg was how well organized the current administration is. I mean, extremely disciplined, and I was surprised to see how well they kept to their message, which essentially was to say no new, I mean, they didn't say it that way, but they said no new commitments. So basically there was no new money being allocated, so all the monies that they talk about actually were already allocated budgets from the past, perhaps slightly renamed. And then the second part was not to engage in any targets and timetables. Now, in all fairness, to say that basically the idea was to say targets and timetables from the past that countries committed to were never fulfilled. So what we need to focus on is implementation. But actually we cannot have implementation without the targets, because otherwise there's no accountability to make sure actually that the partnerships or the new initiatives that are being sponsored really meet the necessary requirements that are stipulated by the international community. So it was, what I was actually surprised was not only how much people of the U.S. delegation were on target, but also that from the lowest ranking delegate to Colin Powell, who I just only saw on CNN in South Africa, how consistent they were in their message, which frightens me to some extent, because I'd like to see more diversity in the government to actually make sure they think of more options rather than being kind of brief in what they need to say. On the other side of it is, though, that there was a very huge non-government delegation of Americans in Johannesburg, showing that there's a huge interest in the United States in sustainable development, and the need is seen to actually make progress. So that's the good side of this story. Yeah. But,
Well, I had a question that actually Ryan asked. I was going to ask you to comment a little more about that sustainability or sustainable development, which is not necessarily the same thing as sustainable community.
Yeah.
But and another thing, like what Rick was saying, I'm curious if there's ever been an ecological footprint taken of the military.
Yeah.
What is that? What our resources are they taking away from?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah. They're securing resources for you, so you can get them from other places. Actually, when we did the research for this calculator for the personal footprint, we compared consumption patterns all over the world to see how much of the resource consumption is in which kind of categories: food, shelter, mobility, and then goods and services. And what we found quite consistently is about 40% of the consumption is not directly associated with household activities. That's like universities, hospitals, police, governing, military. So large resource expenditures are actually not happening directly to activities that you pay for in your everyday life as directly. And so how much of it is a military force? I don't fully know, but we can look at the budget and then get a sense. I mean, there's $400 billion being spent in the United States, and I think the GDP overall is 10 trillion. Is that correct? So it would be 4%. So maybe 4%, I don't know, maybe plus minus, or maybe double per dollar or half per dollar, I don't know. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude of the impact. But actually also I need to admit that we're just now engaging with the Army. They have huge facilities to actually footprint their facilities. And what is interesting that also within the Army there are lots of people who recognize the environmental challenge. And as an entry, we want to work with them on looking at installations and just basically operation of just training bases and where soldiers live and their families. But also through that, starting our conversation with people who think about strategy, because there is interest, that there has been a lot of discussion in the militaries about resource constraints and conflicts. And I believe if anywhere where we start to recognize the link between resource constraint and conflict, we'll be putting more attention to the importance of, we'll be putting more attention to how ecological limits actually have a real impact in our lives and how we need to protect our assets. So I think it will be a positive contribution to sustainability if the military also recognizes more strongly the resource constraints, which will also move into the administration, into civil thinking. So I see it as a positive step, really. And I'm actually quite excited about working with them because we need to mainstream this idea rather than say, you're right, you're wrong. Yeah. Yes?
Could you talk about, I mean, I like the way the ecological footprint applies to whether you're an individual or an institution or a community or a city. I was wondering if you could talk about how institutions on up to communities have embraced the concept and how they put it to use.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the footprint is that you can start from a little pencil and say how much capacity does this little pencil take to a whole country or the world as a whole. One of the most difficult areas to work with, I thought, was actually businesses or organizations, because you can say, what do you compare it to? I mean, because if you compare it per dollar, you would say, okay, an organic farm in India per dollar has probably more footprint than, let's say, a video game programmer in California, for example, per dollar, because they get more paid and don't use that many resources. So does that mean the video gaming is more sustainable than the organic farm in India? So this comparison can be hard. But more and more we figured out there are actually various ways how to engage businesses. One thing is that you actually can look at just how their products, how much capacity their products take, how much footprint the different processes take, how much footprint the whole installation has, just to give them a sense of magnitude. For example, we are starting to possibly work with cement companies. You can say, okay, compared to the size of your plant, how big is the overall demand on the biosphere? And it gives them a sense of impact. But also help them to think about strategy. How will the future look like? Do your products do they fit into the budget of the future? WWF Europe, for example, is working with Unilever, a huge food company in Europe. And what they recognize is, as a common interest, is Unilever just wants to maintain their market share. They don't care whether they actually will be selling tofu or salmon or beef. They just want to maintain market share. So they are interested in engaging in discussions on how may how may a typical menu of the future look like. You know? So that's interesting to them because they can plan for their own positioning. One of the most interesting business projects that we have been involved in is actually on sewage treatment plants. There's a city in California that had a bid on sewage treatment plants, and the council was quite sustainability oriented, and actually thought, oh, we want to see the footprint of the different installation possibilities. And actually then one of the bidding companies won because they worked with us on looking at the various footprint options of the 5 proposed schemes. And it actually changed the decision because one of the schemes would have emitted a lot of methane, which is very greenhouse gas intensive. And so now, because of this incident, a lot of other companies in the business and they themselves have taken footprints on much more seriously, and it's now becoming part of the bidding process. So it's again linking footprints with their own interests. So it meets various conditions. One is that actually it brings the message out into new corners of the world, but at the same time helps them reflect on their own activities. So it has an impact on the way they design. So it's actually, it does both things at the same time, which is a good way of getting ideas out. Yeah.
You did a very good job at quantifying our footprint.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that you've mentioned was that on your ways to reduce the impacts was have twice the technological efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
Would you take into account something like GMOs or corporate farming that, although they're becoming twice as efficient, they're also more harmful on their environment, and where does that balance come about?
Absolutely. That's a very, very good question. How do GMOs fit with the technical efficiency question? So just to clarify one thing about technical efficiency, if we double technical efficiency, it only reduces the demand to half if we don't at the same time increase our consumption. So we have to basically capture to some extent the efficiency gains with tax shifts or other things. So technological efficiency on its own may not do the trick. So that's just one part. Now, there's another piece of GMOs. Are GMOs doubling the efficiency? I don't know actually to what extent, even if they had no other side effects, they would increase the efficiency. I don't know exactly, and I don't believe it will be that much. I think the big promise is that they will reduce on needs for pesticides, or that there will be less crop failures. So that's one piece. The stipulation of the footprint is that we should only include pieces that are potentially sustainable. Activities that are inherently sustainable, they don't have a footprint or they don't have a future, need to be phased out. Now, the footprint cannot decide to what extent GMOs actually are inherently unsustainable or not. That needs separate kinds of studies. So that's, I think, what needs to be addressed first, because there are lots of question marks with GMOs that need to be addressed first. And so quite serious question marks, I think. So the footprint doesn't really address this question. So the footprint doesn't give answers to everything. It just looks at one essential ingredient. Is the human economy exceeding the scale of the biosphere? Or to what extent is it exceeding it? And over time, what are we doing? So the GMOs are actually an interesting example, because if we say GMO are the solutions, we could say we are doomed if it's true, or if we're doomed if it's not true. Obviously, if GMO go awry, and there could be, I don't know, there are all these possible dangers of that actually genes are being mixed into other gene pools and etc. So that would be a disaster. But if actually they just produce more and then this efficiency gain just brings us on higher consumption levels, from which it's even more difficult to become sustainable, then it would be a danger too. So we can't address sustainability purely from an efficiency standpoint. Yes?
I was wondering, have you done an analysis on nuclear energy versus acreage needed?
Again, I think nuclear power may fall in a similar category as GMOs. Is nuclear power systematically unsustainable or not? So that's, the footprint cannot be said. That's what we have to find out through other kinds of analyses. What we have done, just as a crude estimate of the aerial demand of nuclear power, is to say, okay, if we look at all the energy produced with nuclear power since 1970 and compare it to the ecological capacity lost to human consumption through just one major accident, Chernobyl, which happened, what would be the ratio? And it's actually very similar to that of fossil fuel, even a little larger. Because, I mean, essentially the loss of ecological capacity to human consumption was roughly 10%, I believe, of the agricultural production of Europe that could not be consumed. And then there's a whole area around Chernobyl that for many thousand years should not be farmed again. People are apparently still using it, but at rather high health risks. But so that's basically a loss of biocapacity to humanity. Yeah?
How about having children?
Yeah, how about having children? It's a big discussion. I have one, and we decided to follow the Chinese one-child family policy, and we're enjoying it. So yeah, population is a big factor, and I think one of the big tragedies, bringing it back to WSSD, one of the biggest tragedies of the WSSD is not addressing the unmet need to family planning. I think that's the biggest tragedy. The unmet need for reducing consumption may not be as large as the unmet need for family planning. And for example, I've seen studies that say 97% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa could not afford safe and effective family planning, which has tragic effects, not just on the women and children that may not have the same access to services and education, on ecological capacity, obviously, and particularly now in Southern Africa with AIDS. It's a tremendous tragedy. So probably the biggest return per dollar you can get is investment in making safe, affordable, and effective family planning accessible to those people who want it. That would make a really huge difference. Would it be sufficient in order to stabilize or even reduce the human population? I don't know, but it's a huge gap. That's the biggest tragedy that we don't fill it.
You mentioned China, and of course they did have a draconian policy, but it didn't apply. There were 55 exceptions to the policy, and China right now is growing at 30 million net a year. So that's one of the crudest attempts at family planning.
Yeah, I mean there are various approaches to family planning, and some of them have gone badly awry and are very brutal or inhuman, etc. So how can we find the most human ways, actually, of giving people choice and at the same time make sure that we live within the capacity of the planet? Actually, there are quite interesting success stories like Kerala in the south of India or in Bangladesh, where actually, even though literacy is not that high, they were able to reduce fertility quite rapidly. The big tragedy around the population issue is that it's such a big taboo for many, probably on its own good reasons, but the whole cost is borne by the poorest population in the world that are squeezed out both by our consumption and by large populations abroad and their own population growth. So it's a huge tragedy that could be avoided, and just because there's so many taboos surrounding the topic, we don't address it, causing a lot of harm. Yeah?
I think the ecological footprint is a great way of bringing home that each of us are what we use in this planet, and I think that's a great idea. But it concerns me, it's very disheartening when I think that most of the decision makers on every level, local, state, and federal in the United States probably never heard of this idea and probably wouldn't care if they sat in on this lecture. So I'm wondering, while you're giving these lectures kind of to the choir, is part of your message ever going to be assume those positions or try to assume those positions of decision making so that perhaps, if you put the right people in the right positions to make decisions, maybe there would be more of a difference made. Especially since part of redefining progress is not just about the environment, but also about social equity. It just means that, I don't know, that's maybe part of your message that should be stronger for us not to just change how we each live our own lives, but to encourage us to run for office and lead our fellow Americans and, take that.
Absolutely. Totally take a message, yeah. Yay, yeah, totally. Run for office. No, tomorrow we'll be actually having a workout, which is more of a skill-based training on how to become more effective at being a sustainability advocate. So I don't know if actually there's still openings, but that's something we're doing tomorrow. And the more you say, I'm talking to the choir, yes, and wherever I'm invited, I'm happy to go. So I perhaps get more often invited by choirs. That's one thing. But the second part is that actually, as I get through the word, I'm surprised how big the choir is. There are very few non-choir people, actually. And it also depends how you talk to people and suddenly become choir. I've had experiences where actually I thought they wouldn't be choir, talk to them as if they were choir, and that they were choir. So that's one part. And also on the interest, it is true in the United States, getting the attention of government officials, particularly at the federal level, has been much, much more difficult than in other countries. And we have been invited by prime ministers, and in Europe, for example, or we're working with the OECD Roundtable on Sustainable Development. OECD is kind of the club of the wealthy nations, which is it's basically the kind of a meeting round of the ministers of OECD. So what I'm actually quite surprised is to recognize that politicians see the challenge to a large extent. Not all of them, but many more than we would believe. And it's hard. It's a hard process. So I encourage everybody to run for office and move forward. So and I recognize the challenge.
People that really, we all make a difference, yeah. Standards and Poor's, you can bring them in on your ideas. It's going to make a much bigger difference than me putting my drive on the line. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah, Michael would like to add one thing.
This talk tonight is just one of the things that Mathis is here doing during his visit in Missoula. Tomorrow afternoon we do have a meeting scheduled with some city council people and some city government people, so that was directly going to be addressed in his visit. So we're cognizant of that at least.
And I think one interesting phenomenon, I don't know how many of you, have you heard of the term cultural creatives? Just a way of kind of organizing. I mean, I don't know how valid it is, whatever. But anyhow, interesting enough, a large percentage of the U.S. population who wants to see a different world, and they're at least 25%, according to some studies. Their most common comment is to say, "I'm alone. Nobody thinks like me." And they're at least 25% of the U.S. population, according to their concern. And that has something to do with the media, that the media addresses more the modernist worldview, or the consumer, with advertising. Advertisements don't work as well for cultural creatives, so why waste money on them? So you don't see yourselves in the media as much as you actually are present in the U.S. culture. So it's a common comment, I'm alone, but actually we're not as much alone as we think. Yeah.
Staying on the idea of sort of acting on the ecological footprint, I know Project
European level, so it took the footprint of Europeans, of Europe, and then sort of extended that to specific activities, assuming that we could all agree for just a second on what sustainability would look like, came up with specific actions that might be helpful in order to reduce the footprint. Do you see any role for your organization in sort of determining, perhaps saying, we know not everybody's going to agree on this, but we can sort of set some guidelines, come up with specific activities, not only to educate, but that others can take that out and say, look, it's not going to, because what they found in Europe is that it's not a dramatic shift necessarily in lifestyle that's going to bring us closer to sustainability, and that it's actually small steps on a lot of things and big steps on a couple of things. Do you see any role for your organization in doing something?
That sounds very intriguing. I mean, it's always it sounds extremely intriguing. And one thing we have focused on is to just provide accounts and say that's the way it is. Now you choose. So your colleague in the back mentioned on the social justice issue. Right? On some level, you could say the ecological footprint should be called social footprint. It really shows who gets what. We have started to actually not to necessarily take a public stand, but just by putting out the numbers, the conclusion is pretty obvious. And I think if people can take the conclusion themselves, it's much more powerful than being hammered over their heads that, don't you see, the world is unfair? Then it may not be as motivating in some ways. So it's a didactical choice of saying, okay, here are the numbers. What do you think? Oh, the world is unfair? Oh, yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. So let's do something about it. Yeah. So anyhow, yeah.
Well, I was trying to think of some way, even a symbolic way, to begin to try to share the power a little bit. It's awfully hard to get the powerful to give up their power or to share the power with others, and sometimes you have to start with something symbolic instead. And as I was looking at the list here, I was noticing that almost all the countries except one on the UN Security Council have the biggest ecological footprints per person. And I thought it might be interesting to propose to the UN, if they like the ecological footprint idea, to create a sustainability council made up of the countries with the smallest footprints.
That supersedes all decisions by the Security Council.
Power, even if it's nothing more than saying how the UN's Sustainable Economic Development demonstration projects, which ones are funded, that they get to allocate some money and make some decisions and so on, and they'll get some notice and press if it's recognized that what's good about them is their small footprints. They may not have wanted to have small footprints, but that it actually is a positive thing that we admire.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I hope that the ecological footprint could help, particularly countries with smaller footprint or countries in the South, is to recognize other kinds of powers that they have, that actually by trying to imitate the northern lifestyle, they may lose out even more. And the biggest assets they have is remaining ecological capacity, because they could just stupidly just gobble it up and then be as exposed as other countries, or use that as a strategic asset for the future. So it gives them a better sense of what their assets are, so that perhaps it's not exporting most that gives them most power, but really protecting their own ecological assets. So while for some countries like Switzerland, where we use already much more than what we have in terms of capacity, there may be more kind of just a moral side to it. Oh, it may be good if you don't use as much. Countries in the South, I think, it links much more quickly to their own economic interest to recognize that protecting their own ecological assets must be key of a development strategy. Yes?
I don't know if this is something that you can address but you mentioned the cultural creatives, and that's something that's been very interesting to me. That's studies that were done. And I think that one of the authors, Paul Hay, actually has just come out with another paper that he wrote where he claims that there's actually 35% of the American population he would call new progressive. So actually he's actually expanding that cultural creative group into a larger group. He believes, based on the studies, saying that there's that large number of Americans that they have a lot of concern for one thing, the environment, sustainability. I think he claimed that that's a big part of their value system. But what I wonder is how deep does that value system go? And when you talk about when you talk to people as if they are the choir and then they are the choir, that concept really fascinates me. I wonder, do they act like they're the choir because it sounds good, or are they really acting on the ideas that you're talking about? And do you have any way of tracking that?
Yeah, yeah.
When you talk to politicians and when you talk to people, how deep is that level go? Does it mean that people are taking action?
Yeah. Actually, I'm slightly reluctant to the sociologist's approach of putting people into boxes. You're like this, you're like this, you're like this, you're like this. Because my experience of people is, of most people, that we have everything in us. And depending on what we speak to, that comes forward. So people say to me, this is impossible, we'll never make it. And then 5 sentences later say, and technology will save everything and it'll be fine. You know, so we have everything within ourselves, and depending what gets nurtured comes out stronger. That's why the media has such a role in amplifying things that we may not want, but also the positive things. So a lot is present already, and not so much on a strong track, and probably basic needs and basic motivations are much more similar among people. Just the strategies may differ, but we may not be as attached to the strategies really if we dig a little bit deeper. So the way we approach people, I think, is maybe more important than saying, okay, it's this segment that will be like this forever. And by approaching people differently, there will be a different reflection of how we deal with them. But I mean, a culture sets a very, that's more the phenomenon of culture. How can we change a culture that those things come out of people that we see more conducive to sustainability? That's a very abstract answer, but it basically, just like avoid to put people in boxes too quickly. Yeah.
Going back to the translation of the ecological footprint, did you know how, for example, climatic variability of mass affected?
That the area per unit of carbon actually changes over time. And particularly, I mean, some climate scientists predict that as the temperature increases worldwide, there may be various phenomena. One is that the oceans may not be able to absorb as much CO2 anymore as they do now, because there's a pressure differential between the atmosphere and the ocean. There's more carbon going into the oceans than at lower carbon concentration in the atmosphere. The second phenomenon is that as it gets warmer, soils may decompose more rapidly, and there may be more CO2 being put back in the atmosphere. Both would point to the fact that the area needed to sequester the same amount of carbon will increase. So even as we may decrease our carbon output, the CO2 footprint may increase. So these are phenomena that the footprint could track. Is that, yeah? Yes?
Can you make a comment on how a bioregional economic system would be more sustainable than a global economic system? The first thing that came to my mind was the potential reduction of transportation, but are there other factors that would contribute to that?
I think there are many systemic factors, and I think Kirkpatrick Sale compared it to the ice cube tray. You know, if you have the ice cube tray and water stay stable, but if you take out the grid, you know, then the water is much less stable when you carry it around. And I think the same way bioregionalism, just from a systems perspective, makes economies much more stable, because we have a direct feedback loop to our own carrying capacity. So there may still be overshoot in local economies, but the hardship would be felt locally. And we've had that in the past. I mean, in the past we lived by regional lives. So the Easter Islands, for example, collapsed, but the rest of the world hardly noticed it. Now the big danger is that we all put all the eggs in one basket, and we're overall, so making the tragedy of the commons much more pervasive all through the globe, therefore having one big collapse rather than local misdeeds. So since it's much harder to govern a whole world rather than to govern a local place in a democratic way, I don't see any alternatives to bioregionalism for a sustainable world. Yeah.
Is there any thinking, like, are you happy with the assumption of use of half the land for humans and half for other species? Do you think that's high, low, or is there a debate on what might be the most appropriate?
There's one approach out there called the hotspot approach, where some biologists identified that about, 40% of the species are concentrated on about 1.4% of the land area. That are the so-called 25 hotspots all around the world that need to have first priority for conservation. That's what they said. Now, still would be a very sad world. We may be able to maintain some biodiversity in some areas, but then all the landscapes would be transformed. So it doesn't protect landscapes, it doesn't protect the other species. So it becomes also an ethical choice what would look positive. Also, the more we put aside, the more we are, as an economy, resilient. Now we basically use the whole globe at full capacity, assuming that we can maintain the yields forever. But there may be calamities that actually reduce the yields in the future. We don't know. So I think a 50-50 approach sounds to me pretty robust and attractive. If it's necessary or no. WWF, for example, takes a 10% approach because they want to be more on the realistic side of being able to actually achieve these goals. But I think, I would like to live in a world that is more like 50-50 if I could choose.
I think we can take maybe one or two more questions.
Mm-hmm. One. Two. Okay. Did you put up your hand in the back? No? Okay. Yeah.
In our time here in the United States, I see more so those two lines that we showed into the final coinciding than somewhat of a collapse happening, or we could convince people to stop consuming. So my question is, do you feel that reducing consumption, educating people about that is possible in a free market economy?
That's a good question. Let's stay for another hour. At Redefining Progress, we work a lot on how to make prices right, because we believe as long as we live in a free market economy, which doesn't exist really as a free market economy, it always needs some rules and regulations around it. We need to have rules and regulations around it that actually make prices reflect the true costs more effectively. And then also have mechanisms that actually then the money earned through these prices, be it taxes or auctions, actually then benefit the common assets or are invested in natural and social capital. So under these, if we can get the prices right, there's a much larger likelihood of actually not liquidating our natural assets. Unfortunately, now just in the current climate, we actually had to put our accurate pricing and ecological tax shift program on hold right now because the foundations are not willing to invest in these kind of ideas right now because there are no policy openings. So, in other words, there's no debate in the there's no political agenda right now that is supporting tax shift in the very near future. So it's not happening right now in the next 2 years, but it's inevitable, I would say, has to come at one point. So under certain conditions, yeah, we could do better. That's what we say, tax waste, not work. So that's a simple slogan. Unfortunately, I think tax shifts are really the essence, are really at the core of a sustainability transformation. However, the public at large has a hard time talking about taxes, or if you use the word fiscal, perhaps it sounds not as taxman-like, but still it's a complicated word, so it doesn't move forward as easily. So it has been a very difficult campaign to move into the public, even though it's so essential to secure our well-being. Would that be the last one? Yeah. I'll stay here, so if you have more questions, come and join me. Thank you.